Mary.
Thank you. Yes, thanks. Hi there, camera.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay, I'll be happy to. Okay, I am Janet Tucker. I'm an emerita professor of Russian language and literature at the University of Arkansas. My years of employment were from 1990 to 2010. I retired in May of 2010. I have been reading about all and sundry ever since I retired.
Janet, would you please tell about your education? Why did you receive your PhD, and what pros and cons now you could say?
All right, sure, I'll be happy to. First of all, I made the mistake of going through undergraduate school in only 3 years. And I'm sorry now that I did it, because I have had to play catch up ever since with reading about things that I didn't take courses in, such as history, for example, philosophy, science, etc. I got my master's degree in 1965, so you see I am quite ancient but still functioning.
And where did you receive it?
I received it in Indiana, all 3 degrees from Indiana University. I went to high school in Indiana, so for me it was very inexpensive and convenient. And then I got I did my PhD exams in 1969, and I finished the dissertation in 1973. Dissertation director was Maurice Friedberg. The cons, other cons, I don't know what to say. I mean, the PhD exams were comprehensive. We had to know the entire field up until that time, of course, which meant 1969. So we had an exam in Old Russian literature, 18th century literature, 19th century literature, 20th century literature, and I had a field in Polish literature. I had written exams and orals over all of those fields. I thought I got a really good education reading for those exams. I enjoyed it. It was exciting to me to do that.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned Professor Maurice Friedberg. Who were other mentors that were important for your scholarly?
Well, Robert McGuire, who used to come in for a semester at a time from Columbia University, was a wonderful mentor, not only when I was in school, but very much in the lean years after I got my PhD in 1973 until I was hired as a professor in 1990 and had to engage in all kinds of non-academic jobs, from gift wrapping to slicing meat. And Professor McGuire was always encouraging and a really fine reader of one's work with very good suggestions. Professor Chuck Gribble, Charles Gribble, who ran Slavica Publishers and was based at Ohio State University, but had been in Indiana when I was a graduate student, was also a fabulous mentor. Professor Robert Belknap of Columbia was a great mentor way after I was finished with graduate school. I suppose those were the main ones. Excuse me. There was a woman named Blynova, Marta Blynova, who was actually French, married to a Russian, who was my professor of Russian in my last semester of undergraduate school. She taught a class in a Russian literature survey of the 20th century, and she also taught a 4th-year Russian class in which we focused on Griboyedov's Woe from Wit, and she was a fabulous teacher. And we developed a relationship strong enough, in fact, so that some years later, my husband and 4-year-old son and I all went to her apartment for tea and got to interact with her, and the two of them got to meet her for the first time. I think those were my greatest influences. Professor Blynova really, in effect, got me into graduate school in Indiana.
Mm-hmm. And she was teaching literature courses as well as language courses?
Yes.
At undergraduate level?
Yeah, she taught advanced undergraduate in literature, and she, like Professor Belknap, Professor McGuire, and Harold Siegel, whom I had neglected to mention, who taught a survey course in Polish literature, would come for a semester at a time, typically in the spring semester, and then go back to wherever they normally taught. Professor Blinova was centered in Paris.
Interesting. And Professor Siegel, where was he?
He was at Columbia.
Okay. What were the difficulties that you had to overcome after you received your PhD, or as you were receiving your PhD?
No job. I did the meat slicing. I did the gift wrapping. I met a wonderful woman when I was gift wrapping, but it wasn't really what I was trained to do. Those were the biggest problems. Also feeling really alone here, a lack of connectedness, certainly with other people in my field. This stopped once I had students, because then my students and I were all connected, and we were all after the same goal, which was a greater understanding of Russian literature, a greater mastery of the Russian language.
And when you say here, you mean once you came from Indiana with your PhD to Fayetteville, University of Arkansas?
That's right, yes. But, I mean, there were those 17 years when I did not have a full-time job, which was difficult and discouraging, but with the constant encouragement of my husband, who was the one who really pushed me to take my PhD exams, it was all much more bearable, and I stuck with it and figured that at some point I would be teaching somewhere, somehow.
And during this time of 17 years, have you ever considered of maybe doing something else, getting a degree in something that would give you a job right away? Why did you dedicate so many years?
Because when you dedicate yourself to Russian literature, you're nominally crazy, and it's something that grabs hold of you, and it's something that it's not just a field of study, but it's your life passion. And so no, I sort of thought about doing other things. On the other hand, had I gotten a degree in something else, I would have been here during the summers when we normally got away to visit family, and that would have made it difficult. Plus which I would have had to close the door on Russian literature. I didn't want to do that.
And so you came here to University of Arkansas because your husband got a tenure-track position in the Department of History, and why then were you not hired as he was offered a job?
That's a very good question, because in those days they didn't bother about doing such a thing. Nowadays they do. There were some people who were very encouraging. There was Professor Jack Hudson in the history department, Professor James Chase in the history department, who tried to do something for me within the language department. Unfortunately, the language department was not interested for whatever reason in hiring me. Eventually I got hired to do a few courses here and there, not long before I was hired full-time. They were a couple of language courses and a literature survey. I developed a literature survey at the university that I later taught when I was tenure track and tenured. It was a survey of Russian literature from the beginnings, meaning around 11-something, till the revolution in 1917, the October Revolution, and then literature from the time of the October Revolution until the present, which is a fluctuating date. You know, it obviously grew closer to 2000 as time went on.
And when you said when you came here with your husband who received a tenure-track position, we're talking about 1971. So you came to Arkansas with your PhD already in hand from University of Indiana Bloomington, and you waited for 17 years?
I defended my dissertation in 1973. I had taken my PhD exams in 1969, so I didn't have the degree in hand yet. I worked on the dissertation here, And this was the old days. I typed it on a typewriter. And went up to Indiana for my defense on the bus. We didn't have a car at that time.
From Fayetteville?
From Fayetteville.
On Greyhound?
Yep.
Greyhound, wonderful. And what are, you think, as a scholar, you consider the major contribution to the field? I mean, the work or translation that you're very proud of that you've done?
I think my major contributions, I mean, from my point of view, I hope the field feels the same way, I don't know, but the contributions I am most proud of are my book on Alyosha's novel, Envy, which was published in 1996 by Slavica. My essay on Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, which was published in the New Zealand Slavonic Journal, and that was, I'm sorry, it'd take me a second to look up the exact title. Plot Rhyme in Alexander Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, and an essay I did that I included in my edited book on Isaac Babel's Red Cavalry, and that was included in my book Against the Grain, Parody, Satire, and Intertextuality in Russian Literature. Thanks to the great scholarship and fine minds of others, it's a good book.
And who are these people when?
Carol Emerson, for example, Deborah Martinson, Derek Maus, M-A-U-S, who is now at SUNY Potsdam.
And you came to develop these works while you were not employed as a tenure track, correct?
No, that's not true, actually. Those works, were when I was employed as a tenure track person. But I want to clarify the title of the Babel. It's Gas and Oral Usage, Esoterical Devices in Red Cavalry. But the thing really, in a way, I'm proudest of, whether merited or not, is Profane Challenge and Orthodox Response in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment.
Published?
Published by Rodopi in 2008. And one of the essays, one of the chapters was published in SEEJ and then later picked up by Harold Bloom. And it's the one on clothing, religious significance of clothing in Crime and Punishment.
What do you mean it was
Carol Bloom's...
Harold
Bloom, the critical,
yes.
His co-workers, assistants, cherry pick essays that have been published in journals and then bring them together in a single volume.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
So that was done. The last thing I did was the Gogol-St. Petersburg Nexus, published in Canadian American Slavic Studies in 2016, so certainly post-dating when I retired in 2010. And that's the last work I've done or intend to do.
So just clear the date. So you came at University of Arkansas 1971, and 17 years later you were offered a tenure track position in the Department of World Languages.
Well, 17 years after I finished the degree, so in 1993 I finished the degree. 1973, sorry. And then in 2000 I was offered the position.
I see.
In the
17
department.
years
17 years of, but I published during that time.
Yeah, and did you have interviews during this? Were you also on a job market while you were waiting?
No, I didn't. I wasn't on the job market because then I had a son in 1975, and the family would have been splintered, and I didn't want to do that.
And how did you come across Carol Emerson and other people that you mentioned while you were working on your book on Babel?
We must have been on panels together at what was then AAASS and is now SEAS, or at ATSEAL, which I stopped going to when my son went off to college because I wanted to be able to be at home when he came home for break, and that's when ATSEAL conventions took place. So that's how I met Carol Emerson. Been a long time.
Yeah. And what advice would you give for young scholars looking back at your career? I mean, what would you do different, or what advice would you give people now, looking back at your experience? Because many people face the same experience as you do. It's shortage of a job market. So,
given how the job market must be now, I really don't quite know what to say to anybody who is brave enough to get a PhD nowadays in Russian literature and hope to turn it into a teaching job. It seems to me the best thing to do is to follow your dream, but also be practical and know that there is always going to be a need for Russian, for Americans who need to know Russian. And I also think, of course, we have to make sure that we have a system that takes advantage of students and graduates' expertise. We need to have a lot of people around who understand, or who attempt to understand, Russian culture and Russian history and Russian civilization. And these are critical too.
And I wanted to ask you, why do you think it's essential for American education, or for Americans to know what language is, what literature is? You know, we live in the world where, you know, you're saturated with information, with languages, and English becomes lingua franca.
Otherwise, we are culturally isolated. Otherwise, we don't know how other people think. A different language has a different way of looking at the world. And anyone who has studied any other language, I assume, would be aware of that. This is not, American English, American culture are not the only ways of perceiving the world around us. It's a huge world, it's very complicated. And in order to better understand it, we need to know the languages that are at work in that world, that form the world we live in, which is much bigger than just ourselves. Otherwise, we become too egocentric, we become too self-focused, and then you don't understand anything.
And why did you come to study Russian in the first place as undergrad at Indiana?
It seemed exciting. And like a lot of Westerners, I first approached Russian literature through the works of Ivan Turgenev, who wrote Fathers and Sons and Sportsman sketches. And apparently this is the venue for a lot of foreigners to get into Russian literature. But it was, you know, I graduated high school in 1960, and it just wasn't a very exciting time for things Russian, and it appealed to me.
What do you think about the field of Slavic studies, how it changed back in the 70s and 90s and 2000 when you retired? I mean, you witnessed there were some changes over the years. So how the field has changed?
I think what's happened now is not just a matter of how the field has changed, but how universities have changed, how higher education generally has changed. Higher education is tremendously undervalued or devalued. It's treated as something that doesn't really matter in a highly commodified society in which only making money and technical subjects have any weight. It seems to me that such entities as art, the plastic arts, music, philosophy, history, other cultures and literatures are tremendously undervalued because they don't have dollar signs written next to them. And I think that if we neglect these, we are much the poorer as a country and as a civilization. We lose what makes us human, which is having a culture. And by the way, if we don't know history, as people have often said, you're doomed to repeat the mistakes that have been made before. So history is critical to understanding other people and ourselves. How things have changed, that's how things have changed, I think. You know, in a society in which academic jobs are so few and far between, and the only emphasis is on STEM, I think we lose a tremendous amount.
And what do you think would be the future of this Russian studies?
I don't know how to answer that because I don't know what the future of universities is. I think universities have a dim future, not just here, but I imagine in Europe, in Russia, in Japan, in Australia, wherever. Universities have been so devalued, and science has been so devalued, as we are witnessing right now with this current upsurge in coronavirus. I don't know what kind of future there is. I really don't have the vaguest idea. I think right now it's very, very important for us to invest ourselves emotionally as well as economically in such things as study of literature, which helps us to understand others and increases our sensitivity to others and helps us realize our different ways of looking at the world, not just our way. History, philosophy, science, which is critical, which is maybe in some ways the most important thing of all that needs to be understood, and not just applied science, but theoretical science. Mathematics, for example, all these things are very, very important. I think a society that devalues these is on the road to something really bad.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask you about your research that you did on Alesha and Babil and Dostoevsky. How did you decide to work on them? And if you can tell a little bit your PhD that you did with Maurice Friedberg.
Well, I did the dissertation on Aninsky and the Acmeist doctrine. I'm not sure why I picked that. It was just one of those things. But after that, my choices came to me really, the Alyosha, for example, I taught the novel. And when I would teach a work, I would always pace up and down. And when I would pace, it would activate what Poirot calls the little gray cells. And then ideas would come to me about what I wanted to do. And so what I would do with, for example, the Alyosha is I would give a paper at a convention, and then each time I would give a paper, I would expand it and turn it into a potential chapter of a book. The Babil just came to me one day when I was teaching Red Cavalry, which is really just cavalry in Russian, Konarmia, and it hit me that he takes a lot out of the oral tradition. And so I wondered, why does he do it? Always I tried to figure out why, to the best of my ability to understand, does a writer do a particular thing? Like, why does Pushkin have a rhyme scheme in the plot of Eugene Onegin, not just in the structure of the work? And I investigated that to the best of my ability. The Dostoevsky, I was teaching Crime and Punishment for the umpteenth time, and I thought, that's very curious about cloth and clothing in the novel. I think it has a religious significance. And I pursued it. And I pursued it with the assistance of the Russian Gospels, not the Gospels translated into English, because obviously Dostoevsky didn't read the Gospels in English. And the significance, for example, of the shirt, which is a very important garment in the novel. And so this is how I got my ideas for what I later expanded into the Dostoevsky book and the other things that I wrote about. So pacing up and down in front of a class is a tremendous stimulus to one's work.
And what if you were having more time, what research would you pursue? Were you...
Now?
Yes.
No, I am catching up with all the things that I never had time to read. And so I'm reading science. I've read a book about fish, a book about octopi, a book about trees, books about the French Revolution, books about the French during World War II, books about Japan, books about carbon. In other words, I'm trying to expand my knowledge and understanding.
Yeah, but what research were in Russian would you you wish you have done and you haven't? So are there these moments? Oh, I should have written about this, and
Right.
So what do you think you would hypothetically wish to have accomplished that you haven't?
Well, I'm really satisfied with what I did, such as it is, but I suppose if there were one more person I would write about, it would be Chekhov. The short stories, which I think are fabulous.
But what about women writers? I mean, you focus mostly...
Well, there's always Akhmatova, of course. She would be, she and Tsvetaeva would be the #1 women writers I would write about. But I mean, I focused on things that happened to reach out and grab me. And they happened to be male. And that's just how it was. Dostoevsky, I think, in my view, Dostoevsky is the greatest writer of fiction in any literature. And so he was, working with Dostoevsky was daunting. And if it's daunting, it's exciting. And you learn a lot. You understand a lot. You don't quite grasp it. He's not quite like Pushkin, who always slips away. But he's very complex and difficult, which I find fascinating. But what I would work with now, as I said, Chekhov, I suppose. Were I doing that, but I'm not.
I mean, you are a student of Maurice Friedberg. Could you please tell how was it to work with Maurice?
Well, when I first had Maurice Friedberg, he would pace up and down in class, smoking his cigarette in a cigarette holder, and would interrupt, and it was terrifying. Then he was a professor for 2 of my exams in the literature. He was one of the readers on the PhD exam in 20th century, and he was a reader in Polish literature. And then when it came to doing the dissertation, I was working originally with someone else, and because of complications, I switched. And I thought it would be difficult to do, and he made it very easy and was very good with it. He did say, I thought a chapter was too long, and I asked, where should I cut it? He said, cut it. So I thought that was interesting advice. On the other hand, when I had finished, I sent him my work, and he liked it, and that meant the world to me. So
you mean once you started publishing?
Once I was publishing, then I sent him the finished product after it was accepted. Once it came out, I would send him a copy.
And would he give you feedback, or just?
He told me he liked it. Yeah. That was very, very encouraging.
And just to go back to 1973, to University of Indiana, to the cohort of people with whom you've done your graduate work, who were your classmates that pursued academic career or did not? What did they do in case they did not?
Well, I don't really know what most of them did. One of them ended up at Central Michigan. One was at the University of Louisville. One of them ended up as a chair at Ohio State. Beyond that, I don't know, because not everyone finished. I still remember somebody standing up in the middle of the PhD exams, and which took a week. There were 2 hours of written exams per day. And he stood up and said, that's all, and walked out of the room. So that was one of the people I was in graduate school with. I haven't kept up with them. There was someone I kept up with. She didn't finish, and alas, she's gone now. She's been gone for years. So I don't really, the others, I don't know.
And how many articles, you've published between 1973 and the time you've been hired as a tenure-track person? Because it's really unprecedented to be hired after not having, you had informal teaching experience as a tutor.
I'll have to count. About 12.
You published almost article a year while you were doing works like gift wrapping and slicing meat.
Yes.
So you published at the same time article a year in a peer-reviewed journal. So that's what kept you marketable for the position.
Well, I didn't do it to be marketable. I did it, frankly, to encourage myself. It was a shot in the arm psychologically. I thought, well, I'm succeeding. I am doing this now, even though I don't have the kind of job I ought to have. Actually, what's very funny is I went to see the movie Breaking Away, which is about the little 500 and set in Bloomington, Indiana, and I hadn't been hired at that point. And I thought, wow, that's my school, and I can do this too. And so I didn't win a bike race, but I won my own race with myself. I published, and I was keeping alive, even though I felt marketable. I wasn't worried about that. The job market then was good. It's nothing like the way it is now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you, Janet. So any advice or anything you want to add or say that I haven't mentioned, because your experience and the trajectory to becoming a full professor is unprecedented. I don't know what speaks about your strong character. So
a couple of things. Stick with it. If you have to have a job gift wrapping, you'll always know how to gift wrap.
Say it again.
If you have to have a job as a gift wrapper, you will always know how to gift wrap. Follow your passion. Always be open to learning. There's nothing more exciting in the world than learning and trying to understand, which is why I went into studying Russian literature in the first place. Had I had the kind of brain that I didn't have, I would have been in theoretical physics. So this is my fallback for those of us who are mathematically and scientifically challenged. So I enjoyed it enormously. And my students were great. I had tremendous students. I really enjoyed working with them. I found it exciting to be with my students. And they found the classes to their liking, and they learned a lot too, as they would say on evaluations, and as they would personally tell me, including ones I'm still in touch with. So follow your passion always, follow your dream, keep civilization alive. This is your way of doing it. You owe it to the human species, as it were.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.